Hello everyone, and welcome back to Money, Power, Health. I'm Nason Mani. This week, I'll be speaking to Judy or Jihad Makhoul. Judy is Professor of the Department of Health Promotion and Community Health at the American University of Beirut, and has had a rich and varied career spanning academic work on disaster relief, displaced populations, and the commercial determinants of health, but also before that, spent years working with Save the Children in Beirut and Lebanon more generally. In this conversation, we cover how she became interested in her research, her work and life in Beirut, and her reflections on the challenges in conducting research and teaching in the complex and sometimes very challenging circumstances of Beirut in the light of the civil war, the Syrian war, and more recently, the 2020 explosion. I hope you enjoy this conversation. I certainly did. Judy Makhoul, hello and welcome to Money, Power, Health.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm really looking forward to speaking to you about a wide range of your work on displaced populations, the experience of children and families in challenging circumstances, the role of corporate philanthropy in these settings. But first of all, I just wanted to ask how you first became interested in this work in public health. Where did you grow up, and what was your journey on the road to the American University of Beirut?
This is a very interesting question. And I think as I look back, it just happened. There was no plan. So when I was still at university, at school, when I was still at school, I really didn't know what I was interested in beyond being a scientist. And so I applied for a degree in psychology, but when I got there, it didn't feel right because a lot of what we were doing in class was very didactic. And I thought maybe then I can switch to biology. So I was switching around until I stumbled on something called environmental health. And I didn't know what that was because, those days there wasn't a very good advising system for newcoming students. And so the first class that I had, the instructor said, well, what we're going to do in this class is actually do field visits. We're going to go and visit the local dump and analyze the waste products over there and talk to people. And I thought, that is what I want to do. Aha.
Wow.
So I want to interact with people. I want to understand the environments they're living in. And it felt that was the beginning of my mission. And so that was where I was. And I continued my BS in environmental health. And right after that, because it was wartime, jobs weren't available. And I thought, why don't I continue with my Masters of Public Health at AUB? That was back in the early 80s. And I actually did my Masters of Public Health in health promotion and community health. And after that, I got a job straight away in with Save the Children, because that's where I did my practicum. You do a 1 month of sort of training, applied work as a requirement for your graduation. And I was offered a job straight away after that. And there I was for about 8 years with Save the Children. And then after some years of work, I decided I want to do a doctoral degree. But so I stumbled on public health. And I thought that was sort of like meant to be. And so I didn't really plan it. I didn't even know what public health was. And here I am.
Wow. And it's striking even just to hear you talk about how you fell in love with field work and getting out and speaking to people on the ground, because I can see when I look at some of the work that you've gone on to do, that has been a feature, that you keep going out into the field and you keep speaking to people on the ground, and with really, I think, compelling and sometimes quite profound findings. And it strikes me that you since you mentioned that you were studying during the Civil War, And you were saying that was in the kind of in the 80s. The civil war went, as I recall, all the way up to 1990, and then it feels like the context in which you've been living and working has just experienced profound shock after profound shock, which has implications for you personally, but also professionally in terms of what you then work on. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you came to be interested in displaced populations in particular, and how that intersected with the more recent history of Beirut and Lebanon.
Mm-hmm. Well, I witnessed the Civil War. It broke out when I was 14, and it was all over the country, but specifically it started off in Beirut. So we were living in a rural area, and I was going to school, local school. And then they told us you can't come to school anymore because there are troubles. And I was really upset with that because I wanted to finish my final exams. I remember I still had a math exam and I think it was a history exam because I wanted to finish that. But we couldn't finish. We had to stay at home. And then the war broke out in the rural areas. That was in 1975. It broke out in 1975 in the rural areas. It started off a little bit before that in Beirut. And so I did witness the Civil War as I was in the rural areas, and we had to leave our home to go to a safer home, which was my uncle's place, because ours had a roof. And it wasn't cement. And we were worried that, we might get a bomb because the fighting was in the streets and and it was an attack on our village, but also on several villages around here. So we went to my uncle's place and there we stayed for a few days, and we could actually hear the guns and the bombs going around in the village, and we didn't understand what was happening. We couldn't leave the house. And then anyway, our lives were, at risk several times. And then we decided, my dad decided that we need to go to the mountains, and we got ourselves in the car with my uncle's family, and we head up to the mountains. And that was where we were internally displaced for about 10 days. And we found a couple of rooms in someone's house. So we experienced internal displacement, and it still is very, very vivid in my mind. But the journey from the rural village up until the mountains was a very, very risky one, because there were many checkpoints that were checking who you are and where you're coming from. And I remember hearing a lot of stories about people actually being stopped on the road and taken as hostage or being killed. So we were very afraid for our lives. And I remember that quite well. I was just 14 then. And so after things cooled down, we went back down to the village, and we found that a lot of houses were burned and people were killed. But luckily our house was still okay, but we had a few gunshots in the windows. And we continued our lives and we went back to school for a while. And then also during the war, I went to AUB. But for me to get to AUB, to travel from the rural area to AUB, so this was up in the north. Until AUB, you had to go through many checkpoints, political parties and armed people. There wasn't an army. It was just militias all around. And so it was a very difficult thing just to get to the university. And the university was hit a couple of times as well. And when I was there in 1982, we had the Israeli intervention into Lebanon. And so that caused a lot of anxiety for everyone. And so, things continued up until 1984. And then I graduated, and I straight away started to work with Save the Children. And the only work that they were doing, the majority of the work that was going on, this was in the 1980s, was helping out with relief services for internally displaced populations in Lebanon. And the office of Save the Children then was in Byblos, Jbeil, on the eastern side, if you want to call it, because Beirut started to be divided along sectarian lines. So the eastern part was predominantly Christian, and the western part was predominantly Muslim. That was how it went. So I got a job with Save the Children, supporting families living up in the mountains around the eastern areas and up in the north. And so that went on for about up until the end of the Civil War in 1990.
And I suppose what's changed since then and has intersected with some of your academic work is the scale of externally then displaced people who have come into Lebanon, which, as I understand it, is really staggering compared to the scale of to the size of the country. Never mind, the scale of resources available or organizational capacity. How did you come to then revisit your work on displaced populations academically as time went on?
That's a very interesting question that I ask myself, and when I look back, it actually did start with the Save the Children link. When we were doing humanitarian assistance, I was thinking to myself, I think there's something going on here that's not right. I just didn't feel right about it, where you had to apply or just implement directives coming in from the main office. And that was in Connecticut. And I just felt that what we were doing in the area of health and community health and internally displaced populations didn't really apply because the context was different, but I couldn't argue against it. I just felt that there was something not right with that. And as time went on, we started to be involved in community development, not just relief. And so there were a number of primary healthcare centers that were associated with Save the Children that we built or that we rented. And through that program, we started to do literacy programs, vaccination, etc. And I still felt that there was something wrong that we were doing. I didn't understand what it was, because when I was doing my master's in public health at AUB, we didn't take any courses about humanitarian assistance and public health ethics and things like that were relevant. And then when I left Save the Children in the early 1990s, I said, I need to do something for myself. And when I went to Australia to do my doctoral studies, I read a lot about humanitarian assistance and development. And my thesis, my proposal, was people's perspectives on development. Because I knew in Save the Children we were working in development and relief, but I felt there was something wrong. And not until I read a lot of literature that was written with and critiquing humanitarian assistance, and also development work and theories of development, not until then that I understood that what was missing was the participatory approaches to development and the participatory approaches to humanitarian assistance. So involving people in decision-making about what needs to be done to improve the situation for them and their families. And so then when I came to Lebanon to do my research, that was, which was about people's perspectives on development. So I did my thesis using participatory approaches to understand their experiences with development aid and NGOs and all of that. And I wrote a couple of articles that actually bring that out. And that was what interested me in my future work. That was, I think, the seed. So it came naturally. And when I started working with AUB, we had a small grant that was about, assessing the situation in the suburbs of Beirut. And I suggested that we do an ethnographic study before we start out with a survey. And that was where I first really got involved in research about poverty and conditions of people living in the suburbs of Beirut, both the eastern suburbs and the southern suburbs. And that introduced me to child labor issues, inequalities, poverty, from a research perspective, right? So not from a humanitarian practice perspective. And then that led me into further interest in refugees and humanitarian assistance. So I did further research later on with Iraqi refugees. And then a 3 or 4 year study, more than that actually, with colleagues in the Faculty of Health Sciences, involving Palestinians who have been here for a long time, ever since 1948, generations of Palestinians, about their mental health issues and an intervention on that. So one thing led to another, and that was over the years, and I developed sort of a good understanding and an interest in the structural determinants of people's health. And so people's health or mental health or issues are not just a result of their own behaviors and their own decisions. So it's the structure of the country, the war conditions, the politics that actually contribute to the situation that people are living in and their health outcomes. And I could see that developing over the years, and that was very interesting for me. And we wrote a number of articles and we presented in a number of conferences. And I think participation is very important. Putting yourselves in other people's shoes is not an easy thing to do. So all of these lessons I bring into my teaching at AUB as well.
Oh, and I'd love to. Thank you so much for sharing these reflections, Judy. I'd love to discuss your how that feeds into your teaching, but I couldn't miss the opportunity to ask you about your broader reflections on the power imbalances that you've studied and seen directly, because the podcast is called Money, Power, Health because of the importance of these kind of structural forces, the importance of money and power to health and health inequalities. But one of the imbalances that we haven't really touched on yet is that imbalance between displaced and the most marginalized and affected populations and the power of donors, donor priorities, donor organizations, and the subtle ways as well as the very visible ways that influences how these communities are viewed, which needs are met versus which are not, which contexts are understood versus which are not, and it helps shape a lot of that sort of that cycle of either disempowerment or potentially, as you talk about, empowerment. What are your reflections on having studied these dynamics over time? Do you have any reflections or advice for people who are either in the donor world, who are in the development world, who are viewing a country like Lebanon or Beirut from the outside and trying to set priorities?
That's a very, very relevant, very interesting question. Yes, there are, I think, a number of lessons learned and a number of implications for humanitarian agencies, but also for donors. I think what's the big problem is in our parts of the world is that we receive a lot of financial assistance through NGOs or through the government to implement different kinds of studies or different kinds of projects, for whatever reason, for whatever groups. Unfortunately, these come without a good sort of solicitation or an understanding of current needs or gaps or how things work in general in the country for different populations, for different groups. So if you are at the receiving end, you have very little voice because you are, a low-income country. In these days, we are a no-income country. So low-income countries, it has been this way for some time, have very little say in what happens in terms of the kind of assistance that they receive, because they're always, most of the time, they are driven by either foreign agendas or priorities of donor agencies. And this is not, this doesn't apply just for Lebanon, but in general, donor agencies usually set the agenda. And then whoever applies to these or whoever receives them actually come to bear the consequences, whether they be loans, like, for example, from the World Bank, IMF, where that applies, but also different kinds of programs being funded by international NGOs. So anyway, that's the start-off point. So there is very little assessment. And I think it's our problem as well that we do not call for this kind or do not require this kind of assessment. Ever since I was working with Save the Children and back in the 80s, after I graduated with my master's public health, there weren't a lot of agencies, humanitarian agencies, or what we called them NGOs then. They were just a handful. And I remember we were competing with each other for funding coming from USAID, for example. So there was Save the Children, Pontifical Mission, whatever it is, the other NGOs. There were just a handful, as I said. Even though we knew each other and we sometimes collaborated in the field for different kinds of small things, but when we came to submitting a proposal, there was silence. We didn't talk to each other. We didn't communicate with each other. It seemed like our leadership wanted us just to submit the best proposal to get the money without collaborating with others. So it was very much a competitive thing, which seemed, again, as I said before, not right. But that was how things went. And so when we got this fund, we would actually implement it, but also without us doing what we needed to do, which is a proper needs assessment. Because always then, and currently it still is the case, you have very little time. So you needed to submit a proposal within 3 months or whatever it is. So there was very little time to do what we're supposed to do. So first of all, there was competition, very little funding, and still is, especially in our current global situation where humanitarian assistance funding has dwindled over the decades. But also this feeling that our voices, if we have a voice, are not heard, and the agendas come from the West or the global North, where the money is. So the high-income countries or the high-income international governmental and non-governmental organizations have always had the say. And it's, as I said again, I will say again, that it is not always, we're not blaming them, but we need to get our act together. But unfortunately, that is not the case. For over the years, the NGOs have mushroomed, and there are thousands now, local NGOs doing different kinds of work. And I can see that there is very little There is some collaboration, but in general, we're too busy as NGOs to do our work. We seldom have the opportunity to sit and discuss with other NGOs because that takes time, It takes time to set up a meeting. And there are a lot of NGOs that don't know who else is working in the same field. So there might be some overlap. And because there is overlap, there can also be some needs that are unmet. And I know from the Beirut blast, a lot of that happened in August 2020. A lot of agencies were working on the ground, and they got funding from international donors, but also from corporations. And these people have good intentions, but don't know the tools of the trade. So they're not really trained in humanitarian intervention work, in public health, issues related to ethics and needs assessment and all of that. So there's that is another chapter by itself. So there are gaps there. And so from actually doing research with humanitarian agencies recently, but also doing research with refugees over the years, I could see that there is a big gap in terms of the needs that these refugee populations have and the kinds of assistance that they receive. But also there are problems in terms of the context that we live in, because Lebanon, for example, is not a signatory to the 1951 convention that protects refugees from protect refugees' rights. So we have a lot of refugees thrown into prison because they don't have paperwork. Palestinians do not have the right to own, to work in all jobs, etc., etc. So there are a lot of issues there. And I was just incidentally I can't remember what it was. Yes, I was having a discussion on Zoom with a group of researchers from Europe, and they wanted to understand public health ethics in our parts of the world. And I just thought maybe we could talk about public health ethics or ethics in general using the framework of human rights. So I looked at the declaration of the 30 articles just as an exercise. And I went through 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 30. And I thought, let me just check, where are we in those? And I found that Lebanon is failing on every single one. I could not believe it. And I said, no, I have to go back. Let me really think positively about that. So the right to access education, fair trials, and all of those, we are failing on those because we have a variety of populations in the country, and we have discriminatory treatment for socially excluded groups, whether Lebanese or non-Lebanese. So, and the country itself is in shambles now. And I thought, we're in deep trouble. So just to understand, I think, the importance of people's understanding, the importance of the understanding of the situation cannot be done by watching a movie or listening to Fox News. One needs to come and really interact and understand the situation and talk to people and sort of live here for a while, not too long, but just to get an insider's, or we call it an emic perspective of things, before suggesting, donations, before we suggest different kinds of things to be done. And we need to understand the politics of the country as well. So we don't have a president now. There's been a lot of corruption and there's been economic decline for some years now. So all of this, just lessons learned, understand the context before you recommend solutions. And another thing about power and power imbalance, just maybe this last point, if I may, it's these power imbalances are not always locally made. These power imbalances are a result of powerful forces working outside the country. Not to say that we are powerless, no, but we tend to, as statespeople, as politicians, and even the public, tend to be swayed toward sectarianism. Unfortunately, this has been the case ever since the Civil War and even before that. So there are political parties that were in the war and that have now reproduced themselves to be in the state. And there are followers among the people, okay? And so it's sort of the whole system reproduced itself. But there was a 2019 revolution in the country that brought together a lot of people across sectarian lines. But that was not enough. It woke up a few people, but not enough to change the stronghold of these political parties. And these political parties in the country are very much supported by countries around us in the region that also have vested interests in Lebanon, but also are connected to the international powers. So for me, this is very interesting, amazing, because seldom do the local people have this perspective, So it's really important. This perspective is really important, to understand all these linkages, for us to be able to see, to use this perspective when it comes to humanitarian assistance and different kinds of things. So we have a role to play, but there is so much going on in Lebanon that cripples academics, that cripples students, that cripple humanitarian assistance. And because of that, I think a lot of NGOs, for example, put aside their priorities or their ways of working just to survive, just to continue. But then again, that's not what humanitarian assistance should be all about, right? So these power imbalances have trickled down to affect daily lives and the ways people work. And displaced are still displaced. The refugees are still here. Donors still have their priorities. NGOs are still working. But I think there are a lot of needs that are unmet and solutions that are not put forward the way they should be.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack here.
So, yeah, it's very complex.
But that's the point, I guess. It's these overlapping power imbalances, within neighborhoods in Beirut, within regions of Lebanon, political forces within Lebanon. And then, like you said, these donors outside the country, geopolitical forces outside the country. And I think I thank you so much for sharing that. It's so important. And I guess this is part of the reason why ultimately recovery and development is not something that one group of people can do to another group of people. It's something that has to come and be led by those who are living it, those who are there. And that goes back to what Correct. you were talking about before. And maybe that's a good way to segue on to your teaching work, because of course, in the midst of these various crises, and that includes the blast in Beirut in 2020 that you mentioned, you've been teaching through all this time at a university, and hopefully many of your graduates or some of your graduates are going on to grapple with these issues and to find ways to lead within Beirut and in Lebanon to improvements, to a better future. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to teach in such a context? Both the practicalities of doing it, but also, I guess, the accompaniment aspect, keeping students positive and focused and motivated in spite of all these overlapping crises.
That's a very good question. Thank you for asking. For me, I'm just an ordinary citizen, right? I'm one of those people who are living in Lebanon, right? And I've lived in Lebanon for a very long time. Nearly all my life. I came to Lebanon when I was 9, and I was born in Australia. So all this time I've been here. And when I teach at the university, I found that over the years, that teaching for me is a mission. And it's not just the science of teaching. It's not just, how you get students to be able to use this formula or apply this method or do this kind of research or understand this theory, etc. So for me, I think public health professionals, and I teach public health, I'm in the Department of Health Promotion and Community Health. So that requires students to be able to be in a place, understand the place, and look beyond what they see, use critical thinking, and to be able to understand beyond the obvious. So my teaching has, over the years, developed itself to train students on how to think critically beyond what they see. Because students come in, our graduate students, I teach graduate students, they come in like all students without having a critical thinking about the baggage that they are carrying, right? So the culture, gender issues. So we've been sort of trained maybe in schools to just follow instructions. This doesn't work in public health. So I struggle a little bit with students to get them to think beyond their context, beyond what they have been taught. And many of them, of course, they all come from different religious backgrounds, and they have different perspectives on things. There are gender issues that also come into play. So we spent some time thinking about the wider picture. And I use a few questions that I have used from a book that I studied, the first version of it coming out in Australia anyway. So critical thinking is very important. We do struggle with that, but at the end, they get the picture. I teach them also the importance of empathy, putting yourself in other people's shoes. So we've done quite a good job with that. I teach also qualitative health research, where you do exploratory research and you get people to talk about and about their issues, and you do observations. So this has been very well for a number of years, and many of our students have gone to do their, some of them have developed their own NGOs for mental health and different kinds of work, and they've been doing wonderful work in UN agencies. And I remember some of them are saying, I was so happy that I got them, to think about ethics, and I was very happy because I was able to convince them that we need to do a prioritization exercise and assessment. So these are just some examples of feedback that we get. However, over the past few years, I found that ever since 2018 or 19, I found that students have come in, of course, with all these troubles and all these complexities that we are living in Lebanon. And over the years, the number of international students have gone down because of the current financial, economic security situation in Lebanon. And so the students that we have a majority of those are from Lebanon and a small number from the region, because they have scholarships, the regional ones. And so we find that many students are not able to, access the internet at home if they needed to during COVID, because there's no electricity. The situation in the country created power imbalances, actually electricity power. So we didn't have electricity. There are a lot of people who couldn't pay for the generators. The cost of fuel increased, so many of them after COVID could not come to the university, or they had trouble doing so. Housing problems, just buying things, the devaluation of the Lebanese pound, and all these frustrations and fear that we have in Lebanon because of the absence of the state and the political situation really going downhill. So students come in with all of this, and we come in with all of that too. We have our own fears as human beings. We have financial concerns. And so that has been really very difficult. And the university recently has been supportive of this, and there has been an increased number of scholarships and some financial assistance to the faculty. So from that, I felt like, and this is something that we presented just recently in Washington. We had a meeting that we went to, and we presented, a number of, just 3 or 4 of us, about the importance of the art in public health, not just the science of public health. That was just one of the panelists talking about that. So it's wonderful to be able to teach public health, the methods and the science of it, and the calculations and the planning and the management. But if you do not engage the other essential skills, which is putting yourself in other people's shoes, communication, contextually sensitive methods, the ability to be culturally sensitive, and all of these wonderful things, you cannot really succeed in public health, and you can't really teach it. So we've been stressing in the program on the importance of the essential skills, or the art of public health, and not just teaching students how to apply a statistical calculation, a formula, this, that, or the other. And I think students have been appreciating this, because it actually speaks to the issues that they're living in. And of course, and it's always good to be able to sort of adapt your sessions or your classes and make them more engaging to students, where they actually spend some time with you talking about their issues, even in between classes or outside. That has helped, but it has been really very challenging for me, at least, because it requires me to always be up to date with their emotions and their issues. And there are some mental health issues that have surfaced over the past semesters that we don't know, how to deal with. So all of this creates, even though there is a counseling center, but that is understaffed. So all of this creates a very challenging environment for us to continue teaching and getting students to graduate with a degree that helps them apply their skills in a context of continuous turbulence. There's always something happening. There are always issues. We don't have a president. We don't have a government, and the political parties are still working, and there is mistrust in the government, and there is misinformation, and there's economic decline and all of that. And that creates a very stressful work environment. But what helps is that we have collegiality at the Faculty of Health Sciences and a very supportive dean. And I think that sort of like helps a little bit until, things change. So the teaching environment is one of multiple challenges for us and the students. And I hope we will be able to integrate the art a little bit more in our work, and that's, I think, very important. And that's what helps us continue, and continuous reflection. And so I think that's I think so that's what I have to share with you right now.
That's amazing. It's so eye-opening. All the things that one takes for granted, the ability of students to choose to study and to be able to get to university safely, to have internet when they need to work remotely, to not be worried about the future functioning of the state in which they live, of their home, or all these kind of things. It's really fascinating how, not just in your research, but in your teaching, the same values come through of the need for an ethical lens, the need for empathy, the need to constantly critically reflect on what's really going on and to tailor your approach accordingly is something that I find very inspirational. So thank you very much for sharing this, particularly considering the multiple challenges that you mentioned that you face as individuals, as human beings, as well as through your profession and your research and your teaching. This has been fantastic, Judy. I just wanted to end with a couple of questions, if that's okay. The first was, I found that there was another dimension of power and influence that you touched on recently that also relates to your work with the network, the GECI network, in relation to you mentioned corporate philanthropy and donations in a context like Lebanon. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about why you think that matters, why that's potentially problematic, and how that feeds into the work of GECI more broadly.
Okay. Yes. So the governance, ethics, corporate interference. This is very important. This network was, I think it was, we established this network at the American University of Beirut a few years ago, I think maybe 2018, if I'm not mistaken. And this network actually brought together practitioners, academics, researchers from all over the globe, a small number to begin with, who were interested in conflict of interest related to the industry interference in public health research, public health practice. And it was interesting to see that I was a newcomer and I was interested in the structural determinants. That's where I came in. But I didn't know very much about the commercial determinants of health. And that's where I felt at home with this network. And I really didn't know very much, but I started to learn, and it became one of my interests over the past few years. And so the network drew my attention to, as you just suggested, another layer of hidden influencers to the whole world, including the industry and the typical ones, the health harming industries, the alcohol, the tobacco, etc. But this corporate interference also seems to come out in not just research and practice in public health, as it clearly does, but it also comes out indirectly, hidden in the form of corporate social responsibility by these actors through humanitarian funding. So I did. It was just a student-based study that grew, and so we sat. I sat with 2 or 3 of my students who had to do a research project before they graduated with their master's public health a few years back, 3 years back, and we talked about. How do NGOs function? Where do they get their money from? What do they do? And this was also connected to a previous study that also a group of my students did, analyzing or just investigating the codes of conduct or whatever guidelines exist in general to guide ethical behavior in a sample of NGOs in Lebanon. That was about maybe 3-4 years back. And we found that in that study, there were very few that had codes of conduct that talked to the humanitarian staff about how to interact with their so-called recipients or beneficiaries. That was very alarming. So that idea created this, was sort of like the seed for this study, to understand the NGOs, given, that very few have any codes of conduct and the people working there have no idea of the importance of ethics in their work. We did a small study that interviewed about 14 NGOs working during the bomb blast, the Beirut blast, and just before it. And we had difficulty getting people from these NGOs to be interviewed because they were so busy and they didn't understand they didn't understand the issue of corporations and funding, and we just wanted to do an exploratory. And I think they were afraid because they didn't understand. But anyway, many of them came forth, and we had interviews with 14. 2 were international, and the rest were local. And by the 14th, we started to have, we came to a decision that that's enough because we had recurring themes, and people were starting to say the same thing. So we found that many of them do receive either funding or in-kind donations from corporations of different kinds. And these corporations, of course, were interested in visibility for them. And they actually told us that our interviewees told us that, yes, of course, they're all interested in corporate social responsibility and marketing their products. And many of them require that we show their logo and use their branding. But some of them, don't care. They just say, well, distribute these products, and that's fine. So what was alarming for me is that none of them actually thought that this was a bad thing. Because we know that corporate social responsibility in many ways hides the problems that these corporations create for public health. Like, for example, creating loyalty to their products. And their products include health-harming products like the food and beverage corporations, right? So we have Pepsi now supporting tuition fees at universities and at schools. So when students grow up or when they graduate, they will remember that PepsiCo and others have supported them, so they become loyal to their products. And this is just one tiny example that I drew from one of the interviews. The industry also is problematic here because we're dealing with vulnerable populations. We're dealing with children. We're dealing with people who have been affected by the Beirut blast and the very challenging financial and economic situation. The NGOs have no problem with that because, first of all, they think that they are a firewall that would protect their recipients. Number two, they think that the people will not have any problem with that. They will not recognize their logos because anyway they don't have the money to buy their products. But interestingly, also they think that, and there was just this one quote: "We will take money from the devil, whoever it is, so long as that we are able to be financed to continue our work," because they have rent and they need to pay overhead and they have salaries to pay, etc., etc. So I think there's a big conflict of interest here, and but people aren't aware of it, and this is dangerous. So this corporate philanthropy comes in at a very good time for them because there are no questions asked. And just recently, we had an earthquake that hit Syria and Turkey, and we felt it here in Lebanon a little bit. And depending on where you are, people went down to the streets, etc. But of course, a very big corporation jumped in and contributed with some money for humanitarian assistance. And of course, this was shown on social media and everywhere. So this is a perfect situation for them, given that these situations of emergency create vulnerabilities. And when you are in a vulnerable situation and someone comes in to help you, you will remember that. So that's a big conflict of interest, and I think this is on the rise. And during COVID, the tobacco corporations jumped in and also provided sanitary materials and masks through these NGOs to different people. And Philip Morris, for example, the logo was shown on one of the sites of the agencies. So I think this will increase. Given that there is no idea, no one has any idea in the country, and at the university just recently we had a no smoking policy at the university after years of struggle, and at last the American University of Beirut is a smoke-free university. Has been for about 3-4 years or more maybe. But that took a lot of effort, and we're very happy with that. But just recently we had, in one of the faculties at AUB, we had an industry sponsorship conference. And one of my research assistants went down because I didn't have the chance to do so myself. And she said that there was a lot of mention, or there was some mention of the alcohol industry in supporting some of their projects. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of conflict of interest, commercial determinants of health. And we know that there's a lot of funding coming in by pharma for, of course, research at the university. And we have not yet had an intellectual discussion about this, the pros and the cons. Of course, there are always pros and cons, but we need to look at those, together. And so I think that's a future research agenda and a practice that I think we need to engage in a lot and very quickly as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and the parallels between what you've just described and some of the asymmetries in power between, donor agencies and philanthropy more generally are really striking to me, in the sense that both exist because of long-standing vulnerabilities. Both seek to focus on very tangible, measurable sort of downstream effects typically, and neither ultimately addresses the core underlying inequality. It deals with the consequences of that inequality. And in the case of commercial actors, in many ways, these companies exhibit some of the worst of neo-colonialist practices in terms of the way they treat people in their supply chains, the way they inhibit good governance through things like bribery or corruption. But then on the other hand, they're able to claim to be part of the solution by putting their logo on humanitarian aid. And I think there is a lot more work to be done in this area, and to asking, to what degree can we really achieve health equity through picking away at the very measurable margins of single disease outcomes, or single NGO foci or single donor foci, versus we have to deal with the underlying inequity. There's no path to health inequity that doesn't lie through addressing broader inequity, rather than focusing on the downstream, as urgent as it might be. This has been really fantastic. Judy, thank you so much for giving so generously of your time and your insights and your thoughts. I just want to end with one final question. We always like to ask a question for early career researchers, people who are just starting out in advocacy or in health more generally. And it strikes me that you have remained remarkably steadfast and upbeat in your pursuit of public health, both in research and in teaching, in spite of living through, a very tumultuous time in the history of Lebanon and in Beirut life. What advice would you give to early career researchers about how to remain so steadfastly positive? And what advice would you give them to be able to recreate that in their own work?
That's a very good question that I think that we sort of indirectly talk about and practice. But it's thank you for asking that, because it gives me a chance to sort of just put down some lessons learned and some suggestions. I think for me is avoid this the temptation of doing something really huge, because you might be up for disappointment. Like my students always ask me, okay, given all of this, how can we change things? We're not able to change things. Given all of these powerful actors and the problems, and of course, there's always the arms industry and the fueling of wars. What can we do in the face of all of this? I say, well, do something small, do something tiny, and start there. If you can improve or contribute to improving the situation, or even calling out for or advocating for an injustice in the area around you, or just at one level, working with an NGO that talks about prisoners' rights, for example. Do that. There is always room for improvement, and there's always a need for an extra hand. So if you're interested in one thing, go ahead and do it. But don't say, well, I can't do anything. I'm not going to change the world. No one's going to be able to change the world. But, and I always give them an example of Gandhi, who changed the world just by being nonviolent. So you can do a lot of things, but you have to, start small and choose your battles and do what you can, but also network with others who are interested, especially even when you're a student. Start off with, if you have a representative council, join them and talk to them about an issue. Write a letter to the president about this, that, or another. So you need to be practicing these things, even in your local municipality or your local area. If you think there is an injustice, think about it, talk to others, and write a letter. Go and make some noise. And I think this is something in our parts of the world we don't do very well, because we have always learned, we have learned helplessness, and we can't do anything about it. It's greater than us. We just, put our heads and just live our lives. This doesn't work that way. So we can do small things that make a big difference, and we can learn from our mistakes, network with others. But also, another thing is connect with others, just for moral and mental support. And I think this is very important. Our societies are collectivist in nature anyway, okay? So we have extended families, we have friends of friends of friends. We are not individualist societies. We do not work alone. So collectivist societies usually rely on group norms and group support in good times and in bad. So use this and talk to people around you, talk to people talk to others, even, us as faculty members. We have these challenges that unless we talk about, we don't know if they're shared or not. So it's always good to get social support, because we already have these networks and we need to tap into them. I think that's very important. From my perspective, it's been one of the coping strategies for me. So talk to others, but make sure you don't spread misinformation. So that's important. So do small things, do them well, use the science. Network with others, connect with others, but also join international groups like the Associations of Schools of Public Health. We're already members as a university, but we were given a chance to talk with others who were there representing other universities. So I think this kind of network beyond your local network also is supportive. And, I got to know you from the Jesse Network, and we met in a conference in Berlin. And this is just, it's very useful. It's amazing. It's morally lifting that you feel that your work and your ideas are shared and acknowledged, but that you are, supporting your students as well. So have a good relationship with your students, have a good relationship with others. Use the art of public health, the essential skills. Writing is important. Develop your writing skills, your communication skills, verbal, nonverbal, understand the context, empathize, and pray, I think. That's
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Judy. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Good luck with all of your work, research, teaching, and action. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. God bless. Thanks.
Well, that's it for another episode of Money, Power, Health. I hope you enjoyed listening. I certainly enjoyed the conversation with Professor Judy Makhoul from the American University of Beirut. Some really fascinating and extremely important insights on the power imbalances that exist between and within countries and the challenges that those pose for research and for teaching. If you're interested in the work that Judy spoke about, I'll share some links in the show notes. And as always, I'm very interested to hear from you if you have any ideas for guests or future episodes. I'll hand over to Charlie to read out the end credits. Take care.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider leaving a rating. It helps other people find it. The music in this podcast was by Daniel Manny. You can find more information about his music in the show notes. This announcement was read by the very talented Charlie Manny.